Alright, welcome back. We are going to continue our exploration of Chapter 4 of Campbell's Biology. Here we're going into Concept 4.2. Carbon atoms can form diverse molecules by bonding to 4 other atoms. So this is a concept that we kind of introduced last time, but now we're going to think about, well, what does that really mean? Okay. So if you remember, electron configuration is the key to the atom's characteristics, right? So thinking about how those electrons are set up, what arrangement they're in, that kind of determines what an atom and that element is capable of. The electron configuration can also determine the kinds and number of bonds that an atom can form, right? So there are some atoms that can only form 2 bonds, and it's limited to only single or double bonds. It cannot participate in triple bonds, right? So carbon with a valence of 4 can form 4 covalent bonds, okay? Which means that we have a variety of things that we can do. We can make large, complex molecules, and within these molecules, many carbons can be put together, and each of these atoms has a tetrahedral arrangement, right? So you can make a chain of carbons, and each one of those carbons would be the center of one of those tetrahedral structures. And I'll show an image of this in a second. Now, there is an exception to that, and that's when 2 carbon atoms are joined by a double bond, that changes things, okay? In this circumstance, the atoms have a very planar structure, okay? This is also true when we delve into the idea of triple bonds. When we have triple bonds, there we have a very linear structure. We won't get into triple here. We'll just limit ourselves to single and double, right? So I promised pictures. Here we go. So methane is CH4. Structurally, formula-wise, we oftentimes represent it like this, and this is how I often draw things on the board. But what I want you to remember is this isn't how it actually looks. It has this tetrahedral structure in 3-dimensional space, right? Here, this is called a ball and stick model. This kind of extends the bonds to help us see each individual atom more closely. But if you were actually thinking about, well, what does this molecule actually look like? In reality, it looks something more like this, right? With the hydrogen taking up a space that is kind of a sphere fused with another sphere. Right? Now, if we make this longer and have 2 carbons, we have something called ethane, right? So methane is 1 carbon, ethane has 2 carbons, right? We actually have a naming system that can tell you what to call things. If you have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 carbons, right? Now, something to consider here is that each carbon has this tetrahedral structure. So when we link 2 together, we actually have 2 tetrahedrons stacked on top of each other, right? Now, remember that each one of these hydrogens is going to take up a certain amount of space. So when you see something like ethane, you'll notice that there's a slight rotation around the carbon-carbon bond so that this hydrogen does not clash with a hydrogen right here. If we tried to put a hydrogen shifted over, they would tend to clash with one another. So it has it slightly askew. This is going to also be a huge determinant in what types of structures you can actually build utilizing carbon. Now, we brought up the idea of, well, what happens with a double bond? Okay, with a double bond, and here we have ethene, or oftentimes called ethylene, which is essentially the same thing as ethane, except for we have a double bond. Now, something to notice here, we have a double bond, So we have fewer hydrogens, right? The hydrogens take up whatever bond is left over. Here, we're sharing 2 here, so we have slightly less. Another thing to consider here is notice that the precursor here, F and F, is the same. F is actually what we use to describe 2 carbons. Same thing holds true up here. Meth is what we use to describe a single carbon. Now, if you look at the structure of this, it has a very planar structure, right? It's all sitting in the same plane. And even when you look at the space filling, it looks the same way. This has consequences, and we'll talk about more of those later. Now, if you want to understand why it creates this structure, remind me in class to talk about that. This has to do with the fact that we are forming bonds with pi bonds, and it has a unique arrangement. But we'll talk about that in class if you want to. All right, the electron configuration of carbon gives it covalent compatibility with many different elements, right? So it can bond with just about anything. So let's stop and take a look at some of its most frequent partners, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, right? So that in combination with carbon gives us the 4 major, or 96% of what everything in life is made of. So here we have hydrogen. Hydrogen has a valence of 1. Oxygen has a valence of 2, so it can form 2 bonds, which means that it could form a single bond with carbon, and maybe you would fill up those other spots with hydrogen. So you put a hydrogen here, and the second spot on the oxygen, you'd put a hydrogen there. Or you could form a double bond with carbon. Right? So you have some flexibility. That, of course, is going to have a structural difference, and it will behave differently. Nitrogen has a valence of 3, right? So we can form a carbon-nitrogen bond. We could also form a double bond between nitrogen and carbon, right? And we can fill up those extra spots with hydrogens or whatever else, or other carbons, whatever we want. Okay. So, before we were looking at structural models of carbon just bound with hydrogen. Let's see what happens when we start branching out, looking at some of these other things, such as oxygen and nitrogen, that we can bind to. So here's carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has oxygens, 2 of them, and they form double bonds. Okay? Those double bonds, if you remember, create a planar structure, and the fact that this has 2 of them means that this is a very linear element. In space, it looks exactly like this. A big oxygen over here, a big carbon in the middle, and oxygen over on this side. Okay? This can have some consequences when we start talking about photosynthesis. All right, another thing. Let's talk about combining carbon with both oxygen and nitrogen. Okay, so this compound is called urea. That should sound somewhat familiar. Sounds very similar to urine, right? So urea is a compound that we actually make and put into our urine to essentially get rid of excess nitrogen in our bodies, right? So carbon, we can breathe out as CO2. Nitrogen, we can't breathe out, so what we do is we pee it out in the form of urea. So here we have carbon, double bonded with oxygen, and then nitrogen, and any empty spot is filled up with hydrogen. All right, so this diversity that arises from these variations in carbon chains builds most organic molecules, right? So what can we do with these carbon chains? Well, we can vary the chains by length, and we can vary them by shape, okay? We can do a lot of different things. So, for example, we can vary the length. So here's 2 carbons long. Here's 3 carbons long. It's called ethane. This is called propane. Eth meaning 2, pro meaning 3. We can adjust, instead of the length, we can start looking at branching. Okay, so here's butane, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. And here's something known as isobutane, which has 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons still. And if you count the hydrogens, they have the same number of hydrogens. But you can see it's a very different structure because we are now branching. Here we can also change, if there is a double bond, where that double bond is. So here we have a double bond at the end. It gives you something looking like this. Here we have the double bond in the middle, which is different, right? So if you look at these things in three-dimensional space, they will in fact look very different. In addition, we can also form rings, right? So we can take carbons and link them around in a hexagon type shape. This is called cyclohexane. We can also do this with double bonds present. So here's something that we call benzene, which has 3 double bonds present. This has some unique characteristics. Shape-wise, these things are shaped slightly differently. So here in benzene, it actually is a flat hexagon. For cyclohexane, it's not actually a flat structure. It has bends in it that gives it three-dimensional space, and we might touch on that at some point. All right, if you take just these carbons and just the hydrogens, we get what's called a hydrocarbon, right? Now, what's unique about carbon and hydrogen? Remember that this is a non-polar bond. So consequently, hydrocarbons that only have carbon and hydrogen are non-polar and consequently are hydrophobic, right? So many organic compounds, organic molecules, such as fats and various lipids, have hydrocarbons as part of their overall composition. Okay. One reason why you might make a hydrocarbon chain present in something is to give it that hydrophobicity, right? That's one purpose that you may have of utilizing that. Another purpose is that hydrocarbons can undergo reactions and release large amounts of energy. Okay. So we can use hydrocarbons for fuels, and this is also why we use hydrocarbons to power other things. So gasoline is a hydrocarbon, right? It's actually a mixture of different lengths of hydrocarbons. And we catch them on fire and they explode, right? So we can do a controlled version of this in our body. We store this in these fat cells. The actual name of it is called an adipose cell. Here's the nucleus of that cell. Remember, it is DNA is in the nucleus, right? But in the rest of the cell, its job is to store hydrocarbons for fuel, and it stores it as this molecule right here. This is called a triglyceride. When you take a bunch of triglycerides and put them together, it forms a little fat droplet. And you can actually see these fat droplets if you look at these cells under the microscope, right? So here, this triglyceride is very hydrophobic in nature. The red here does indicate some oxygen, so there is some polar bonds present up in here, but they tend to be hidden by the hydrocarbon chains. All right, we will stop here and we will pick up in part 2.